So the purpose of this webinar really came about to serve two purposes. One was really just a refresher of the basic rules on NVZs. NVZs have been around for quite a while. A lot of us will be quite familiar with them to some degree, but I think it's always useful to have a bit of a refresher and a reminder of what we need to do within nitrate vulnerable zones. And the second thing, and really the primary motivation for this, was really just to highlight a few pitfalls that I see from time to time occurring in my dealings with farmers. Sometimes there are aspects of the nitrate vulnerable zone rules that people maybe don't quite fully understand, and they can find themselves possibly on the wrong side of the rules. So it was just to highlight a few of those pitfalls. So as I say, nitrate vulnerable zones, NVZs, have been around for a long time. The first one was designated in, I think it was 1996 at Balmalcolm in Fife, shortly followed by the Eitham catchment in Aberdeenshire. And then in 2003, so 20 years ago this year, was the main introduction of NVZs to a large part of eastern Scotland, primarily the sort of arable farming areas, as marked on the map. There were a few changes around 2016. Some of the NVZs were actually reduced in size around the edges. And also there was a new NVZ in the Stranraer lowlands down in the southwest corner there that was designated in 2016. So they've been around for a long time, and they're there basically to try and reduce the level of nitrates getting into watercourses, to prevent pollution of aquatic ecosystems, and also because of some concerns about potential health risks of nitrates in drinking water supplies. So they've been around for a long time. We're all aware of them. But what I'm going to do in the course of this webinar really is just go through some of the key elements of farming in a nitrate vulnerable zone, what you need to be doing, the rules you have to be following. And I've kind of highlighted on this the sort of content that I'm planning to go through during the course of the webinar. So the first two things on this list, the RAMS map, livestock manure storage capacity calculation, these are things that although they're an essential part of the NVZ rules, that they tend to be more of to some degree, a sort of one-off thing that once you've done them once, that's them done. Whereas as we move down the list, maybe the things that we have to keep an eye on and adjust year by year in terms of our planning and our record keeping. So we'll look at the RAMS maps, the calculation of livestock manure storage capacity, the maximum nitrogen limits for each crop type, the NMAX, the field limit for organic manure applications, and the farm loading limit for livestock manure. So three different types of nitrogen limits that apply within the NVZ regulations. And then finally looking at the closed periods for fertilizer applications. So those are the kind of the core elements. It's not that there are little bits and pieces around the edges as well, but particularly in terms of record keeping, and I will touch on that at the end. But that's the sort of order that I will go through the regulations. So starting off with the RAMS map, the risk assessment for manure and slurry. As I say, this is something that generally is a sort of one-off thing. You have to have a RAMS map for your farm within an NVZ, but it tends to be something that once it's done, it's done. You don't normally need to update it every year because it will generally stay the same unless something changes. You maybe buy some new land or sell some land, or some other change happens, but generally speaking, it will stay the same. So it may take a little time to put together, but once it's done, it is done, and as long as you have it from year after year to refer to. And basically, it is a map to show what the risk is of applying manures and slurries to the land on your farm. So ranging from areas that you shouldn't be spreading any manures and slurries on at all, through areas that are high risk, where you could only really apply manures and slurries in absolutely ideal conditions, through moderate risk areas where you would maybe take a bit of care deciding whether to apply manures and slurries if, for example, there was a forecast of prolonged or heavy rain shortly afterwards. And then through to the low risk areas where, generally speaking, it'll be okay for spreading pretty much year round. So obviously it's pretty key to identify the areas where you really shouldn't be spreading at all, and those are broadly speaking areas less than 10 meters from any watercourse or standing water. So still occasionally see people spreading manure on stubbles, and you can see they've not really left that 10-meter gap from a ditch at the edge of the field. And of course, once you've spread it, that's pretty obvious that you haven't left that 10-meter gap. So that is definitely one to just watch out for. You shouldn't be spreading less than 50 meters from a spring or an uncapped well or borehole. And you wouldn't spread, generally speaking, manure or slurry on unimproved land, land that's rough grazing type of land that's never really been cultivated or improved in any way, or conservation areas on the farm, and also steeply sloping land. And steeply sloping land is really one of the key considerations for spreading risk. It's not the only one. You also take into account things like whether there's been recent drainage work or whether the land is prone to be waterlogged and so forth. But steepness is one of the key ones. And unlike this chap here in Switzerland, you probably wouldn't want to be spreading slurry on a slope that steep. And the general guidelines are that these are the kind of slopes that put land into different risk categories on your RAMS map. So steeper than 1 in 5, generally speaking, you wouldn't want to be spreading, whereas less than 1 in 14, then that's generally going to be low risk. One way when you're drawing up a RAMS map, and this is a method that I tend to use to assess the steepness, is that you can, if you have a map of the farm that has contour lines on it showing the altitude of the land, you can measure the distance between the 10-meter contour lines on the map. So the lines that indicate a height difference of 10 meters, see how far apart they are and use that to determine the steepness of the ground. So if the 10-meter contour lines are less than 40 meters apart as you measure them on the map, then that is probably going to be a no spread area. If they're more than 140 meters apart, it'll generally be a low risk spreading area. All other things being equal, and in between you can see the kind of cutoffs of the high and moderate risk there. So measuring that kind of distance between contour lines is quite a good way of assessing spreading risk when you're initially doing the RAMS map. So the closer the contours are together, the steeper the land, and the wider apart, the flatter the land. So that's generally the way that I assess steepness and when I'm drawing up a RAMS map in the first place. So moving on to the livestock manure storage calculation. This is really a kind of two-part exercise that you have to do. The first is you have to calculate the volume of storage that you have for slurries and poultry manure, and that, like the RAMS map, is generally going to be a one-off calculation that you do, and it's a basic mathematical exercise measuring the volume of cylinders and cubes and so forth to calculate what your storage capacity is in the different slurry stores and other dedicated storage spaces. It would stay the same from year to year. Obviously, if you built a new slurry store, or a slurry store was dismantled or taken out of commission in some way, then you would obviously need to amend that calculation. But the calculation of storage volume is a kind of one-off thing that should do from year to year. The other element of this calculation, though, is to calculate how much slurry you're likely to be producing, and that is something that may vary from year to year. It'll probably stay similar unless you have major changes in livestock numbers, but that's a calculation that you can do using standard figures for the volume of slurry produced by different livestock classes that is available in the NVZ guidance, which I'll show the link to later. And that can be used to calculate how much slurry is being produced, and then you're basically, those two parts of the calculation you are then fitting together, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you have sufficient storage space for the volume of slurry or poultry manure produced. And the requirement is for 26 weeks of storage capacity for pigs and poultry. For all other livestock slurries, it's 22 weeks storage capacity. And I think there's new general binding rules that have been brought in mean that these requirements actually now apply outside the NVZs as well, not just within the NVZs. So you use the standard values in the NVZ guidance to calculate what your requirement is. You also need to take account of any rainfall that will enter the store directly or indirectly, which obviously a roofed store will have less rainfall entering it than an open store. These are, calculations that require you to know the kind of average rainfall and surface area that rainfall's falling onto. And you also have to allow for freeboard in all the slurry stores. You can't be assuming that you're able to fill them right up to the brim. You need at least a 300 millimeter freeboard for most slurry storage facilities. Of course, a lot of people won't have slurry or poultry manure on their farm. They may have more straw-based farmyard manures that are quite typically stored on field middens, and then obviously the calculation of storage capacity doesn't really come into the equation for that sort of situation, because a field heap can be any size. There's not a kind of limit to the storage area. However, that while you may not have to calculate a storage area, it doesn't mean that there are no NVZ requirements for storage of farmyard manure, straw-based farmyard manure. The first one is that you are meant to mark the location of your field middens on your RAMS map each year. For each year, you would take a copy of the RAMS map and mark on where your field middens are. And this seems to be something that's maybe been overlooked quite a bit in the past, but seems to crop up more and more in NVZ inspections, the department asking for that information to be marked on the RAMS map. And obviously you would not be wanting to park your field middens within a no spread zone, because you wouldn't want to be storing manure anywhere where you wouldn't be happy spreading it. So certainly not within 10 meters of a watercourse, 50 meters of a well. You need to stay away from those areas for storage. The other rule, which I think sometimes gets overlooked a bit, is the requirement that field middens should not remain in one place for more than 12 months. I think a lot of people probably have favored sites where they dump the manure, but by the NVZ rules, you should not be using the same place for more than 12 months. you should be moving it somewhere else. You're not necessarily having to move it particularly far, but certainly not on exactly the same place. And then once you've moved it away to a new location, you can't return back to the first location for storage within 24 months. So you've got a full 2 years that it would have to be left clear before you could start using it again. So I think that's one that people maybe haven't always paid attention to, or maybe not necessarily been aware of in some cases. And it's possibly the reason why the department are now wanting to see field middens marked on the RAMS map, so that they can, so there is an auditable trail there. If you look back over 2 or 3 years, you can see where the middens have been. So moving on to the various types of nitrogen limits that apply under NVZ rules. So there are 3 sort of sets of limits you need to be aware of. The first of these is what we call Nmax, which is the maximum amount of nitrogen that can be applied per year to each crop type. And that is nitrogen from any source, so that includes bagged chemical fertilizers, but it also includes organic manures. And the limit applies to the crop type, not to individual fields. And I'll try to explain that in a minute, just how that, because sometimes it's a slightly difficult concept to always get your head around how that's calculated and what it means for applications on individual fields. So in a moment, I'll try and explain that. So within the NVZ guidance, there are all the Nmax limits for different types of crop. So within grass, you have limits that vary depending on whether on how the grass is managed. Firstly, things like silage fields have a higher allowance for nitrogen than grazing fields, for example. And then there's for grass, there's a thing called site class that comes into the Nmax, and the site class is based on the average rainfall on the at that particular location, and also the type of soils that are in the field. So basically, if you have a higher rainfall, you tend to move towards the left of this table into the lower site class numbers, which gives you a higher allowance of nitrogen to apply. And in the soils, if you're on shallow or sandy soils, then you tend to move to the right of the site class table here and have a lower allowance of fertilizer of nitrogen that can go on. But generally speaking, the limits, well, I suppose it depends where you are, what type of farming you're doing. From my viewpoint, based in the northeast of Scotland, tend to not see a lot of farms putting on anywhere near the Nmax on grass. It tends to be much lower than these limits, particularly in recent years with the price of fertilizer, people trying to cut back a wee bit. I mean, obviously that may be different in other parts of Scotland, particularly areas where maybe dairy farming is more prevalent. There will almost certainly be much more nitrogen going on there. Yeah, and even within an area like the northeast, there will be farms that will be putting on more towards these limits, but a lot are not. By contrast, with arable crops, tend to find that certainly, well, I don't know whether it's starting to change a little bit with high fertilizer prices, but generally have found in the past that people tend to apply fertilizer up to the limit they're allowed on arable crops. So tend to find that farmers are quite familiar with the sort of standard limits that they are permitted. And this particular table is for the NMAX for different cereals, but for what's called nitrogen residue crop group 1. And the amount of nitrogen you can apply to these crops depends on the residue group, which is basically what the previous crop was. So if the previous crop was cereals, carrots, Swedes, turnips, and linseed, then you're in residue group 1, and these are the standard figures. So basically, if you've got a field that you're cropping, in cereal crops, more or less year after year, they will generally always be in residue group 1. But there are other tables with generally lower limits for the higher residue groups, where you've got preceding crops that tend to leave more residual nitrogen in the soil that the current crop can pick up. Again, the soil type is an important consideration. If you're on sandy loam or other mineral soil, which is fairly, the sort of normal type soils, I suppose, you've got that column there towards the middle of the table, 130 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for spring barley, 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for winter wheat. If you get into much more organic soils, and they're probably not particularly common, sort of really peaty soils, then the amount of nitrogen that you can put on is much, much lower, because those organic soils tend to have more nitrogen locked up in them due to the high carbon content. The other extreme, sandy soil, sand soils or shallow soils, you are allowed to put a bit more nitrogen on, because they tend not to have much organic matter in them that helps to lock in the nitrogen. So they tend to be quite low in nitrogen to start with. Obviously, you need to know what type of soils you've got. If again, that's a kind of almost a one-off thing that you need to do initially. Once you know, then that's going to stay the same indefinitely. Sorry, I'll come back to that slide there. But there is a useful resource, which is the soil map of Scotland, which you can find at this website, map.environment.gov.scot. And there are various different soil maps available there, but this particular one is a layer called Map of Soil Texture in Nitrate Vulnerable Zones. And you can zoom right in, and it'll tell you whether your soil is a sandy loam, whether it's an other mineral soil, whether it's sand, whether it's a peaty soil. And you can look at your individual fields and work all that out, and that'll help you do that. I'll just now go back to that previous slide. I said before that the NMAX is something that's calculated for the whole crop type rather than by the individual field. But when you are actually calculating it, you do have to look at the individual fields. And this is a kind of mock-up of a sort of example farm to show how that's done. So here's a farm with 3 green fields here, which are permanent grass. And then there's 4 yellow fields, which are spring barley fields. So 2 of the spring barley fields are a typical, maybe a sandy loam or other mineral soil, the 4-hectare one and 3-hectare one, and they've been cropped maybe in barley for a number of years, so they're in residue class 1. So there you have 4 hectares with a 130 kilogram limit on nitrogen, and a 3-hectare field with a 130 kilogram of nitrogen limit. So you multiply the area by the limit per field, and it gives you a total amount of nitrogen that in theory you would want to apply to that field. So 520 and 390 in this example. You've then got a field there on the top right corner, which is a sandy soil. 2 hectares, and that has the higher. I mean, again, it's been continuously cropped in cereals, but that has the higher Nmax of 150 because it's a sandy soil. So 2 hectares at 150 gives you a limit of 300 for that field. And then the biggest field there, the 6 hectare, was previously potatoes, which puts it into residue class 2 because potatoes leave a certain amount of organic residue that then supplies the following crop. So in residue class 2, the limit for spring barley is 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare lower, so it's down to 120. So 6 hectares at 120 gives you a total for that field of 720. So you work this out for each field like that, depending on the type of soil and what the previous cropping is. But then you add all the totals for all the spring barley fields on your farm together. And then you do the same for any winter barley, and you do the same for any winter wheat. And you get a total number of kilograms of nitrogen that you can apply to your total spring barley crop. So in this, it's 1,930 kilograms of nitrogen in total across those 4 fields, which total 15 hectares. So that is the total amount of nitrogen you can apply to your spring barley. You don't have to stick to the individual field limits. You could put more than the individual field Nmax on one of those, so long as you put less on another, and it all averages out, in this case, at that less than 128 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Obviously, you're going to get the best results if you try to stick as close to the requirement for the individual fields, but the limits are set across the totality of all your fields of each crop type. So I hope that kind of clarifies that in case there was any kind of confusion. So looking at some of the Nmax pitfalls to avoid, and again, these are things that I have occasionally seen crop up over the years. First thing is to remember your organic inputs. It's easy to think, right, the limit here is 130 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and then put all that on in bagged fertilizer up to that limit. But then forget that you've spread some farmyard manure on the field before you ploughed it in the spring. But that organic manure will be supplying some nitrogen. So you have to take that into account. And obviously, if you're routinely applying a lot of organic manure to your crops, you'll probably be aware of this. It tends to be the sort of thing that catches people out, where maybe they only occasionally spread, say, farmyard manure, or maybe they get some digestate or some other organic manure from an external source on their land. And if it's a kind of something that they're not normally in the habit of doing, it can be easy to kind of forget, well, yeah, that's applying nitrogen. So you maybe need to cut back on the bagged fertilizer to make sure you stay within the Nmax limit. The second thing is to always check your residue group. Again, if you're in the habit of always cropping the same fields year after year, you'll be used to the field being in residue class 1, and you may be very familiar with what the limits are to the nitrogen you can put on fields in that residue class. But then, say, one year you suddenly decide, oh, that old grass field could maybe do with ploughing up, so you plough up a grass field and put it into barley for a year or something before it goes back into grass. In that year, that field of grass, that barley that has been ploughed out of grass, is going to be in a higher residue group, and therefore will contribute a much lower amount to the overall Nmax figure. So that sometimes catches people out. They think, right, my spring barley Nmax is 130 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, but you forget you've ploughed it out of grass, so it's lower for that particular field. And it's maybe something that, because there's maybe less rotational farming, people tending to crop the same fields year after year, that where you do plough up a grass field to put it into crop, it can sometimes catch people out. The third pitfall I was going to mention was that there are adjustments to your NMAX that you can make. If you have routinely high yielding crops, you can have an increase to your NMAX for those crops. And likewise, if there's heavy rainfall at certain times of the year, you can make adjustments, not though in residue group 1 crops, just in the higher residue groups, for the rainfall adjustments, that is. But if you want to use these yield adjustments, and I know particularly the yield adjustments people are sometimes keen to use, you have to be able to provide evidence that you are routinely producing these higher yielding crops. So whether that's tickets from combines showing the weight that you've harvested, or whether it's from sale receipts from grain going off the farm, where you can demonstrate that X tons of grain were sold off the farm and you had so many hectares of that crop, and you can therefore demonstrate that you were high yielding. So you need to have that evidence, and I think it's more than 1 year's worth of evidence as well to produce that. So it can be difficult to get suitable justification for that, but it can be done, and I've seen it done on a number of farms. Just to give some examples of how the NMAX can be, how some of these pitfalls can affect the NMAX. Here's some examples. A typical application of farmyard manure could add anything in the region of 12 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So you would have to then reduce your bagged fertilizer by that amount from the NMAX to keep within the limit. Slurry, which has higher available nitrogen available to the next crop, could be 50 to 60 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for a typical application of cattle slurry. And in terms of the residue group thing, I mentioned the pitfall of ploughing fields out of grass. The other one that sometimes catches people out is if you decide to sow a fodder crop, brassica type fodder crop, graze it down, and then plough it in to and put barley in that field the following year. That barley will be in a higher residue group because of the preceding fodder crop, and could be as much as 70 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, depending on how the fodder crop's been managed. And likewise, crops following grass, depending on how old the grass is, how much clover there is in it, how recently it's been grazed, and so on. The effect of a preceding grass crop on a cereal crop can reduce the NMAX by 20 in the mildest cases, but up to 110 if you were ploughing out a really thick, old, permanent grass with high nitrogen content. So so it's something to be aware of, because that can make quite a difference to your overall NMAX for each crop. So moving on to the second limit that you need to be aware of for NVZs, and that is the field limit for organic manures. And that is that there is a limit of 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare from any organic manures per year per field. And unlike NMAX, this is on an individual field basis, field by field. You have to be able to demonstrate you've kept within that limit. The other slight difference from NMAX is that I was just speaking there about the nitrogen that different manures can apply to the crop. When you're looking at the NMAX, you're looking at the available nitrogen. That is the the nitrogen that's in the form of ammonium, nitrogen, nitrate, nitrogen, uric acid. Basically, nitrogen that is after you apply is going to be available to immediately to the following crop. So for NMAX, you're looking at that available nitrogen, but all manures will have a higher total amount of nitrogen in them, because some of the nitrogen is locked up and won't be available to the immediately following crop. And when we're looking at this 250 kilogram per hectare field limit for organic manures, we are looking at the total nitrogen rather than the available nitrogen. So that's a slight difference to be aware of. What this means in kind of practical terms is that to get to that 250 kilogram limit for typical for cattle farmyard manure, you'd be looking at something like 40 tons to the hectare, 16 tons to the acre. For slurry, you're talking about 96 cubic meters per hectare, 8,500 gallons per acre. So these are reasonably high levels of application, and probably higher than most people would typically, in most cases, would be applying in one application. However, the thing you have to be careful of, and this is a pitfall that can catch people out, is that this limit applies to any 12-month period in the year. So if you've put on some organic manures, any manures that are put in within 12 months from that date will add to that total. And this is a sort of scenario here on this slide, which shows how you could potentially get caught out. So say in year one, you put on 25 tons per hectare of normal farmyard manure. That's probably a fairly typical application rate. And you do that at the end of February, the 28th of February. That's going to be putting 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare into that field. So that's well below the 250 limit, so no problem with that. If you then go back the following year and do exactly the same thing, another 25 tons per hectare on the 1st of March, so you've left 1 year, 12 months and 1 day between applications, then there's no problem, because you've only had 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in the 12-month period. The second application is into the next 12-month period. The problem comes is if you are just fractionally less than the 12 months. So the first application is just the same, end of February, 25 tons per hectare. But on the 28th of February, but say the second year, you go on the 27th of February and do exactly the same. Although it's only 2 days difference, you're then within the 12-month period, and you've suddenly got 2 lots of 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, so 300 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in total over the 12 months, which is over your 250 kilograms, and you're therefore in breach of the NVZ rules. So this is something that can catch people out. And another, it's not just necessarily that kind of a day or two short of 12 months. The other situation where you occasionally see issues arising with this is if you have a winter crop following a spring crop, and say you've put organic manure on just before the spring crop went in, then it's harvested, and then a winter crop goes in the autumn and gets some organic manure that autumn, then you've obviously definitely got 2 applications within the 12-month period. So you have to then be careful that you're not exceeding the limit. What we generally recommend is that, for example, for farmyard manure, rather than putting on 25 tons per hectare, stick to 20 tons per hectare as your limit per application, because that means that 2 applications of 20 is is just below, gives you just below the 250 kilogram limit. And similarly with the slurries, you could put half the limit on in any one application. If you can't do that, and you have to put on more than half, you just have to watch that 12-month gap. And obviously, if you can leave it a year and a day between applications, you're fine, but you can't keep doing that indefinitely, because the second application is always getting a day later, year after year, and eventually you would need a kind of gap year to reset back to the start. So the third limit that you need to be aware of is the farm-based livestock end loading limit. So this is a calculation across the whole agricultural area of the farm. So it's not per field, it's not per crop type, it's everything. It's all the crops, all the grass combined, and basically it means that the rule is that you can't have more than 170 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare from any livestock manure source averaged across the whole farm area. And that includes, unlike the previous two limits, that includes dung deposited by grazing livestock, as well as any manure that's spread on the ground. So generally, the way that is calculated is that you have to keep a record of the livestock that are coming on and off the farm, and you calculate using standard figures in the NVZ guidance what the total amount of nitrogen you would expect each of those livestock classes to produce based on the numbers you have averaged across the year. And that gives you the total amount of nitrogen you would expect your livestock to produce. And then you have to make adjustments if you export any manure, or if you import manure from another farm, then you have to kind of adjust that total nitrogen from livestock level for that. And then you divide it by the total number of hectares of agricultural land on the farm, and you have to demonstrate that you're below that 170 kilograms per hectare limit across the whole farm. If it looked like you were going to be above 170 kilograms per hectare, and that generally happens on maybe things like pig farms where there's maybe a lot of bought-in feed and not a huge amount of land, maybe not sufficient land to absorb all the nitrogen produced by the pigs, then you would have to export some of your manure to another farm to reduce the total, so to bring your average your rate down below 170 kilograms per hectare. The kind of final bit of the sort of regulations I was going to look at is the closed periods, and I think probably most of you will be familiar with the closed periods. It's something that doesn't really change from year to year, so once you get used to the dates, you should hopefully find it easy enough to keep to these limits. So so there are basically two sets of closed periods. One applies to manufactured chemical fertilizers, bagged fertilizers, and the other one applies to what are called high available nitrogen organic manures, so slurries basically, and other poultry manure and that sort of thing. So looking first at the manufactured chemical fertilizer, basically in the autumn you can't apply those fertilizers after the 1st of September on arable land, or after the 15th of September on grassland. And then in the springtime, you can start applying nitrogen fertilizer again on the 15th of February if you're in the more southerly NVZ areas, or the 20th of February if you're in the most northerly of the NVZs, the Murray, Aberdeenshire, Banff and Buchan one. So those dates are fairly straightforward. There is one exception, which is that you can apply autumn applications of nitrogen to winter oilseed rape and other brassica crops like forage crops during the closed period, up to well, for oilseed rape, there's a crop requirement table value that you can use, and for other brassicas, you can put up to 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare within that closed period in the autumn. So that closed period is fairly simple, fairly straightforward. Not really too many pitfalls to that one. The second one is the closed periods for high available nitrogen organic manures. So as I kind of said before, the difference between available and total nitrogen in manures is that the available nitrogen is that which comes out quickly and can feed the following crop, the immediately following crop, and isn't locked up for longer periods in the soil. So high available N organic manures are those where more than 30% of the nitrogen is in one of these readily available forms, ammonium, uric acid, or nitrate. And I mean, just to maybe give a sort of example, something like straw-based farmyard manure would normally have about 10% available nitrogen, so it is not a high available N organic manure, whereas say cattle slurry might be about 40%, pig slurry might be 50% available nitrogen. So those are the high available N manures, and most poultry manures would also fall into the high category. So for those particular types of manure, you have a closed period to observe, and the closed period depends on the soil type and also what the ground is used for. So on grassland, you can't apply these manures after the 1st of September. On sandy soil, sandy or shallow soils, or the 15th of October on all other soils. On crops, the start of the closed period is the 1st of August on sandy or shallow soils, and the 1st of October on all the other soils. And then the closed period ends the same date, whether it's crops or grass. But it basically ends on the 31st of December for sandy or shallow soils, and the 31st of January for all other soils. So those are your closed periods for high available N organic manures. But again, there is an exception on cropped land. So on sandy or shallow soils, you would normally not be able to apply these manures after the 1st of August, but you can put on applications up until the 15th of September, provided there has been an autumn cereal crop sown before that date, or in the case of oilseed rape, sown, you can apply up to the end of September on oilseed rape, or catch crops or cover crops that are sown before that date. That exception obviously doesn't make much difference on soils other than sandy or shallow soils, because the closed period doesn't start until the 1st of October for those. There are one or two little pitfalls just to be aware of for those closed periods that I've just described. Firstly, if you're putting on any high available N manures slurry in July, August, or September, even if you're outside the closed period, you have to be sowing a crop on that land within 6 weeks of the first application. You can't just apply slurry to sort of fallow or stubble ground in August or July, or whatever if you're not planning to sow an autumn crop within 6 weeks. The other one, which maybe people are slightly less aware of, is that there are quantitative restrictions that apply to the amount of high available N manures that you can apply immediately either side of the closed period. So it isn't a kind of once you're outside the closed period, you've got a complete free-for-all. There is a period either side where there's a limit on what you can put on. So for the 4 weeks prior to the closed period, and also up until the 14th of February each year, those limits are 5 tons per hectare for poultry manure, and 30 cubic meters per hectare for any other high available N organic manures, so slurry. So you might remember, I think I said on one of the previous slides that your 250 kilogram per hectare field limit for cattle slurry could be as high as 96 cubic meters per hectare. But if you're applying 4 weeks before the closed period or before the 14th of February, you would not be able to put that rate on. You would be limited to these quantitative restrictions. And I think occasionally possibly catches 1 or 2 people out that limit. So the final thing I was going to look at really was the record keeping requirements. So we've spoken a lot about the regulation, rules and regulations, what has to be adhered to. But obviously there is a record keeping requirement. If you have an NVZ inspection, then you have to be able to demonstrate that you're meeting all these rules and regulations. So sorts of things you will need to have available are, well, firstly, a RAMS map. And as I mentioned, if you've got field middens, you should have those marked with a cross or something on your RAMS map. You need the cropping details for each field on the farm, showing what the soil type is, the area of the field, and when the crop was sown. You need to have done an NMAX calculation for each crop type by the beginning of March, ideally, by the rules. So you need to have calculated what the NMAX is for each crop type. And then you have to have a record of what you actually applied to that field in terms of fertilizer, and remembering to include any organic manures applied to each field. And obviously you'll want those records of applications to be within the NMAX limits for each crop type, and and of course for the for any organic manure applications to be within the 250 kilograms per hectare field limit. So you need your records to show that you're adhering to those particular rules. You'll also need to have your details of your livestock, so the species, the type. So there are different age categories in the guidance for cattle and sheep and so on, and the length of time on the farm. So the simplest way is really just kind of how many of each class have you got each month, and then you average it across the year. And the purpose of that is to be able to show how much nitrogen from livestock there is on the farm, and that's so that you can demonstrate that you're meeting the farm-based livestock loading limit. So and associated with that, you'll need to keep details of any imports and exports of organic manures, because that obviously adjusts your livestock nitrogen loading limit, and you'd need to keep a record of where those manures were going to or coming from. You need your calculation of your storage capacity for slurry and poultry manure, and obviously, as I said before, the volume of storage is a kind of one-off calculation, but the amount of slurry that needs to be stored will be based on the livestock numbers that you're keeping a record of, and you need to calculate that. So I've already mentioned the RAMS map, location of field middens. The other thing is that sometimes gets forgotten, I think, is you're meant to keep an inventory of the manufactured fertilizer that is brought onto the farm and used and retained at the end of the year. So you would maybe have a sort of 1st of January starting balance, how many bags of fertilizer you had in the shed left over from the previous year, then how much you bought in that year of different types of bagged fertilizer, and then on the 31st of December, how much have you got left over? And then from those 3 bits of information, you can obviously calculate how much fertilizer has been used on the farm during the course of the year. And that is a kind of a check almost of whether the nitrogen applications that you've recorded for each field are realistic. And it's worth kind of checking whether they are. I mean, I think most people have a good idea of how much they're putting on, and people say, right, I'm putting on 200 weights to the acre of whatever fertilizer, or 1 1/4 hundredweight or whatever. So people know that in their mind, but you can get a much more accurate application rate if you look at how much of the fertilizer has actually been used in terms of what was there at the start of the year, what was there at the end of the year, what was brought in, and then dividing that by your acreage of the crop will give you a potentially slightly different figure in some cases, but worth checking anyway sometimes. So that's your record keeping requirements. It does look maybe quite arduous, and it may be why a lot of people use consultants to do this sort of thing. But I mean, there is software out there that can be used to keep these records. I mean, we quite often use the Planet for Farmers software. There'll be other similar software doing the same sort of thing. Quite often it's more general sort of fertilizer nutrient management software rather than a specific NVZ compliance tool type of software, but they can, most of them can, if you plug in the information, they can give you the information you need for your NVZ compliance. So for example, in Planet, the Planet software, you can plug in your cropping, provided you've got the previous year's cropping in as well, and you've entered the soil types for all your fields. It'll tell you your NMAX for your spring barley or your NMAX for your winter barley, and it'll give you that figure without you having to get the calculator out and work it all out for yourself. You still have to plug the numbers in yourself, but the calculation is done by the software. So that kind of is bringing us more or less to the end. If you are looking for any further information, there are other resources on the Farm Advisory Service website. So there's a publication which summarizes some of the things that I've spoken about in this webinar. There's a video as well, which again highlights a few of just the key points that I've spoken about. And then, of course, it's well worth looking at the Nitrate Vulnerable Zone guidance for farmers on the Scottish Government website. So gov.scot, search for NVZ guidance, and there is a whole heap of the guidance booklets. And within that, there are all the tables that I've shown. The tables of the NMAX limits under different residue groups, and also, all the calculations you need for the nitrogen produced by different livestock, and the nitrogen that's in different organic manures for your 250 kilogram limit. So well worth having a look in that if you're keen. Okay, well, thanks a lot for listening. Now, I think the Farm Advisory Service team will probably be sending an email out to attendees probably tomorrow with a survey basically asking whether you found the webinar useful. Be grateful if you could fill that in. I believe there is some sort of prize, a hamper or something for people available for as a competition to incentivize filling in the survey. So please do try and complete that. But if there are no other questions, thanks for attending, and I hope you found it useful.